It is time, my friends. Time to take the plunge and uncover the mysteries of the mid-17th century. To procure a pretty petticoat. To uncover the secrets of stay-making in one of the most underrepresented periods of historical costuming. Why? Because if it ain't Baroque, don't fix it. This is my favorite era of clothing. It's so exciting to finally share this video with you. A quick note, if you're here expecting one of my famously wacky reveals, that isn't going to be in this particular video. Like my other 17th century makes, there's so little information out there on this period that I want this video to be a good reference for folks who are actually wanting to make these kind of gowns. I want to have enough space and time to show you all the gooey details and the idiosyncrasies of this wonderful time period. So we're gonna build the petticoat and bodice today. And then in the next video, we're gonna trim the heck out of it and turn it into a fantastical dark unicorn costume. So, are you ready to dig deep? One of the most daunting things about this project was figuring out what to use and how much of it to use. Because there's really no reputable pattern out there, it was kind of just a guessing game. I used a total of 6 yards of 44-inch lutestring silk from Burnley and Trowbridge for the petticoat and bodice combined, with very little fabric left over. Note that I'm an exceptionally economical cutter. If you're new to sewing or not used to being economical in your cutting layouts, I suggest you add at least another half yard just to be on the safe side. If you're using a 54 or 60-inch fabric, it's a little bit different. You're looking for about 2.5 to 3 yards for the petticoat, depending on your height, plus another 1.5 yards for the bodies themselves. Remember that those giant puffy sleeves take up way more yardage than you think they do. You'll also need an additional 2.5 to 3 yards of either the same fabric or a contrasting one for the overskirt. For the sake of time, we're not making that in this particular video, but I wanted to mention it because it is a part of the ensemble. The extant garment has 2 interlining layers of canvas containing the boning. You'll want 2 layers of something medium to heavy weight that is tightly woven. You'll need 1 yard each of your 2 interlining layers, maybe 1.5 yards if you're larger or longer in the waist. I used a layer of moody blue cotton sateen and a layer of white coutil. You'll also need 1.5 yards for your lining. I'm opting for some basic 5.3 ounce linen for the actual bodice lining and using some more of my sateen for the sleeves just to give them a little more structure. For the most part, the actual construction of the petticoat is quite similar to the 18th century petticoats with a couple of differences. Firstly, it is a center back closure instead of a side closure. There is also a pocket, which is awesome. But after a little bit of thought, I have decided to skip the pocket on this particular petticoat. This particular silk that I'm using, it's the weight of silk habitat. So it is very delicate, and I just keep thinking about how hard I am on my things, and me reaching in and out of those pockets, I fear for the seam and the construction of the garment. I'm worried it's gonna rip. For now, I think I'm just gonna put pocket slits into this and wear my 18th century pockets. The bottom of the petticoat will be trimmed with this lovely lutestring silk that's blue shot with purple. Like in the 18th century, this petticoat was hemmed flat and leveled from the top, so I felled my strips together and hemmed it by hand. The main reason I used the 1660's gown from Patterns of Fashion 5 is because it has what I believe is one of the only remaining petticoats left from this particular time period. Because these petticoats were sewn selvage to selvage, they were ripe for picking apart and turning into something else. Petticoats probably ranged in circumference from about 100 inches to 140 inches. My advice for picking a width is to utilize the selvages and the particular width of the fabric that you've chosen. So 2 panels of 54 or 60-inch fabric, or 3 panels if you're using 44-inch fabric like me. You'll just measure from your waist to the floor in your supports and shoes and multiply that by however many panels you're planning to use. Hey, that rhymed. Note that we are doing this over a bum roll, so your back is going to be longer than your front. I've made a simple schematic and instructions for the math part of this available for you for free on my Ko-fi page. I've linked to it down below. Donations, no matter how small, are greatly appreciated, since that's how I keep this channel running, but they are by no means expected or necessary. I appreciate you even just being here. This stuff is a little too delicate to rip on grain, so I carefully measured down the length instead and cut out my pieces. Woo! This is the front. I decided to put a center blue panel in here, mostly because I spent most of my budget on this gown on the fabric, so I did not have a lot of budget left over to do trim. So I'm gonna be a little bit creative. I think it is going to be really pretty. The bottom of the petticoat is also going to have a blue band on it, so it's gonna make that T that I feel like is characteristic on a lot of the gowns of this particular period. This next bit is gonna look very familiar to you if you've ever made an 18th century petticoat. Center back gets pinned, leaving an opening at the top to get in and out of. The side seams will be open about 14 inches down from the waistband to accommodate for the leveling and pocket slits. This is the same distance as the extant petticoat. When you sew it together, you get a tube. Next, we're going to take our pre-felled strip and attach it to the bottom of our tube so we get an even longer tube.
Wow.
The silk is too delicate for my serger, but unravels bad. It's also a little too lightweight for cartridge pleating, so I killed two birds by covering the raw edges with a spare bit of quilting cotton. The center 8 inches of this petticoat sits flat without any kind of gathering. Then the rest is gathered with wideish cartridge pleating. I'm opting for 1/2-inch pleats. These are just initial pleats put in to help me level the hem, but the final ones are the same size, only there's 3 rows of stitches instead of 2. Speaking of leveling, off camera, I went ahead and tried to fit this on my body using this piece of teal fabric that I have left over from an old project with various degrees of success. So the idea of this was to get kind of a general idea of how this is going to be shaped over the bum roll. It's not even per se from one side to the other. I went ahead and used chalk to kind of delineate where the bottom of the waistband is lying, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this off, I'm going to take out the cartridge pleating, kind of true it up and make it as even as possible, and then we'll work on getting this prepared to do the real cartridge pleating and the real leveling. The front isn't too weird or wonky, so I folded the top over by 1 inch before starting the cartridge pleating. The back took a little more finagling, but we got there in the end. Cartridge pleating is so time consuming, but wowzers, is it satisfying when you finally get to pull those threads. One final check before I permanently sewed the waistband down, and it's looking pretty good and level. Even if I should have turned my ceiling fan off to film this bit, whoopsies! The waistband gets backstitched to the top of the petticoat. Notice that I pushed the cartridge pleats in one direction. This is similar to how the extant was done, and one of the reasons people thought it was knife pleated. Then the waistband is folded over the top edge and stitched to the back. Here's the finished waistband sewn down. I also decided to take some advice from a blog I found and added 2 ties in the center front to make it easier to put on, as well as a second set of ties in the back to help keep it closed, since center back closing petticoats aren't great with staying shut on their own. Okie dokie artichokies! We have a lot to cover in this video today, and I want to make sure I'm showing you the important things, the things you don't see every day, the mysteries of these 1660s bodies. So I have to do all of the cutting out, drawing the boning channels, and sewing the boning channels. You've seen me do this a million times, so I'm gonna go ahead and do that, and I'll catch back with you after that tedious and boring task has been completed. Wish me luck, y'all. Full disclosure, and I'm not saying this to scare you, I just want to be transparent. Sewing all of those boning channels took me more than 2 hours. Not including assembling everything, took me probably another 1.5 hours to get all of the boning sorted and everything together. Not including actually drawing the boning channels. Corsetry is not difficult, but it is very time consuming, and there's no way to get around it, unfortunately. Between you and me, I've been harboring a sports injury now for a few months, and it's a particular injury that makes flexing my foot like this hurt. And of course, it's the foot that operates the machine pedal. And it hasn't been bothering me that much with normal sewing, but sewing these boning channels hurt so bad that I actually had to stop in the middle and go ice my foot for 20 minutes. All I can say is, I'm glad it's over. A couple of things of note I'd like to bring to your attention if you're interested in making something from this era. Firstly, both of the two bodices that I've been referencing from the 1660s that we have extant versions of, which is the Fashion Museum bodice from Bath and the one in the V&A, both have horizontal boning channels on top of the vertical boning channels. So the one in Patterns of Fashion 5 is only conjectured as far as where the center front horizontal boning is, but I went ahead and kind of just stuck with their instincts and did one kind of at the top of the bust and then slightly below the bust. The two horizontal bones that are done on the back are diagonal in line with the arm straps. So on the extant garment, and I think this is really interesting, these bones were actually stuck in between the stitching of the boning channels that are going vertical, which is really easy to do if you're hand sewing all of those boning channels. But machine sewing the boning channels took me 2 hours. I can only imagine how long hand sewing all of those boning channels would have taken me. So I tried to think of a way to do it that would make my life a little bit easier. This is how I ended up doing it. I drew the horizontal channels in a different color. Then on the machine, I backstitched at the beginning of the channel. Instead of cutting the thread and starting fresh below the channel, I simply kept the thread linked to the needle, moved the fabric down to the bottom of the channel, and kept going. This created horizontal bars of thread over the horizontal channel. Then I used scissors to snip everything at once. The next thing I want to bring to your attention is there are a couple of bones that need to be inserted into the fabric pieces before you assemble the actual piece. So I went ahead on the white side of the inner lining, which is going to actually be closer to my body, and I marked with a T with just regular ballpoint pen all of the ones that need to be inserted before I sew the curved seam. I only thought about one of them when I was actually doing it. The rest of them are the bones that are over the tabs, and so I had closed the tabs. Dummy me. Otherwise, I just followed the pattern as far as the directions of the boning channels went. It's pretty straightforward. They're all pretty much going straight on grain up and down, except for the said horizontal ones. So now that we've got all of that done, we can move on. It was time to shed the security of the lacing strips in favor of the actual eyelets. I cut a strip of the silk wide enough to encompass the eyelet section and boning channels around it. I took a similar linen lining strip and tacked it down to the coutil side of the center back strip. Then I tacked the silk on the other side, looping the seam allowance over the raw edge of the center back but under the linen. From there, it was just a matter of smoothing everything down before adding in the eyelets. I drew my busk onto a strip of coutil and added a scant amount of seam allowance for the busk pocket. Then I made a little cover. Unlike the Regency era, these busks go in from the bottom, so the top will be sewn shut. The pocket will then get tightly hand-stitched down. Make sure you do this after you've added all your boning, or else you might accidentally close your channels. I honestly don't think it's possible to sew the seam neatly on the machine. Note that the extant garment's structural layer consists of different sized pieces that don't have the curved seam, but I wasn't about to make and fit 2 separate patterns for this baby, so we're gonna suck it up and sew it sandwich stitch style. So this is a heck of a lot easier if you turn in your seam allowance before you sew your channels, but I needed to fit the thing first, so I'm doing this out of order in a not as ideal manner, which means that I have to sew the bottom portion by the machine still, and I had to rip some of my stitching to get the seam allowances inside. Ugh. With the seam allowance prepped, I could then make my fabric sandwich with the bread, aka the lining, on the outside and pin it down. The sandwich stitch is also known as the English stitch or catch 3 skip 1. If you'd like a full tutorial and an explanation why I prefer the term sandwich stitch, the short video is linked down below. This is a very strong stitch that is preferable for high strain seams like those that you get on bodies, corsets, and stays. The puckering is ugly, but oh well. Cue adorable distraction. Man. am. I'm not a flower. Stop trying to pollinate me. Can I have my hand back, please? Once the honeybee was gone and everything was sanded down, I closed up the bodies on the machine to lock all the boning in place. To reinforce the center front, it was suggested to me to use some homemade buckram. This intimidated the heck out of me. But in the end, it was super fast and super easy. I opted for the xanthan gum method since it's readily available at most grocery stores. The recipe is 1/2 of a teaspoon of xanthan gum per cup of water, but I'm having the recipe. Stir everything together vigorously. Psych. A whisk is way better. Whisk that puppy, whisk it good. Then let it sit for 5 minutes. Slime. Use a pastry brush to cover first one side and then the other. Nice thing about this stuff is that it's food safe, so no special equipment required. Then let it dry till stiff. I did 2 coats. With the buckram drying, it was finally time to assemble the bodies for real and give them an actual try on. Miracle of frickin' miracles. It fit perfectly with an even gap and no discomfort first time around. Time to party, friends. Okay, now we wear the heck out of it while doing our everyday activities to make sure everything is a-okay. Let's get this bitch assembled. The extant garment has some boning within the shoulder straps, but I'm too scarred from sewing all the other boning channels, so they're officially 86'd. I had a really hard time remembering what direction to put these on, so learn from my mistake and make sure to permanently notate your registration marks on the shoulders. Here are the finished buckram pieces. It kind of sounds like paper. While it was suggested to me to use these buckram pieces as reinforcement, nobody actually said where to put them. The Fashion Museum bodice is reinforced inside with paper, but not with any extra stiffened linen. The V&A bodice does have some at the very center front point. So I'm going to put it there and thought maybe all along the bust channel would also be good for keeping the front flat. This will get whipped into place by hand. At 10 o'clock, when I was finally sewing this down, I decided that the buckram tip better served the center front inside the busk channel, so I layered a few scraps together first and then tucked it into the tip and sewed it in there. Okay, we've cut out the fashion fabric, finally! This isn't at all required, but my silk is so delicate, I decided to flatline it using the last of the navy cotton I used to cut out the petticoat reinforcement strips. Here's the completed structure of the bodies. After whipping the buckram, I pad stitched it in several places in order to keep it secure. Then we need to add the boning channel flap. I know that for the majority of this video, it's felt like not much has happened. That's kind of the nature of stay making and corsetry. 70% of the work happens in just a couple of steps. But the good news is that we have overcome that hurdle. From here on out, it's gonna be bing, bang, boom as we take this basic structural pair of bodies and turn it into an actual bodice. And from here on out, it's mostly just some light hand sewing. Since the center front is the focal point of the bodice, we're going to bind it before we add the fashion fabric. This will help reinforce it while still keeping a beautiful front edge. I'm using 1/2" cotton twill tape for this part. The extant garment lined the tabs separately. This is a great idea because this means that if you need to dig in and make adjustments in the future, you don't have to undo all the tab binding to do so. First, I secured the back tabs with the lining that has been hanging around from the eyelet step. For the rest of the tabs, I grabbed some old linen scraps and simply lined up straight edges with the tabs and cut scraps to fit. I did not pay a lot of attention to grain here. Here they are, all tacked down. Except for the tops of these things, you only need to loosely secure them with running stitches because they'll get sewn down properly when we bind the tabs. Because the silk is so delicate and shows needle marks, I opted to flatline by hand. The back and side pieces were flatlined without seam allowances to reduce extra bulk. So I've lost my mind and decided that bedazzling more than 8 yards of metallic lace wasn't enough work for me for this project. And so I'm going to completely embellish and embroider the center front as well. To make that easier, I set about sewing tailor's tacks on the center front to keep my seam markings visible for the embroidery process. Say bye-bye to the center front fashion fabric, y'all. She's gonna move on to the next video and get her ass embellished. Bye-bye! Here's our lovely flatlined fashion fabric pieces. Starting in the center back, we're gonna pin these flat and smooth them out over the structure of the bodies and then pin the fabric down. Smooth it out all the way to the shoulders and pin it there. Sew the back seam with a prick stitch and then whip the side seam down. The shoulder seam only needs a running stitch for now. Repeat the same process for the side piece, pinning the side seam down with the seam allowance tucked under, lapping over the already sewn back piece. Then carefully stretch and smooth the fabric over the foundation and pin. The side seam will get a prick stitch like the center back seam. Once everything is in position, then deal with the tabs. Starting with the back, align the fashion fabric carefully with the edge of the back tab and pin. Then cut the fabric even with the other side of the tab. Continue moving from the back to the front. So one thing I want to draw your attention to as I'm doing this, we have to remember that our body is not flat, it's curved. Otherwise, patterning things would be so much easier and we wouldn't spend so much time on mock-ups. But that's not the case. So something that's really important, something I hope you take away from this video, is that when you're sewing something that has a flat fashion fabric that is going over an already established foundation layer on something that has no ease, that fits very tight to your body, that stretches a little when you put it on, you want to make sure that when you're sewing, you're not sewing on a flat surface. That's going to make wrinkles in your fashion fabric. Instead, you want to stretch it around something curved. And for me, in this particular case, that's my thigh. I find this is the best and most convenient thing for me to use. And so what I'm doing is I'm starting in the back and I'm working my way forwards, stretching it over my thigh as I go. And then when I get to the end, I'm going to go back in the same direction and work on the bottom. And it's really important that we work from the back to the front because then we can smooth any excess wrinkles, any excess fabric out towards the seam allowance and make sure that it's captured in the seam allowance instead of being all loosey-goosey on our body. Onto the straps. I am going to tuck under the arm side edge just a little to keep it from fraying. Okay, my friends. Now that our fashion fabric is sewn on the center backs and the sides, there's only one thing left that we can do before we finish the center front embroidery. And that is cleaning up the front edge and binding down the tabs. So, got my pins, got my tape, let's go get it done. All right, my friends, that is the binding done. In the next video, you can look forward to seeing us adding the center front fashion fabric, lining the inside, binding the top edge, as well as adding the shoulder wing and the sleeves. All of those are going to be decorated and pretty and sparkly. I cannot wait to show you the final outfit. It is going to be very, very fancy. That's it for this video, y'all. I hope that you found this helpful, and I'm so glad to finally be able to share this process with you. If you'd like to see the final make in all its glitzy glory, you can check out this video here on the screen, or watch this other 17th century adjacent video if you're watching this before the final make goes live. Thank y'all so much for watching. I love y'all, and I'll catch you in my next video.